Augusta, Maine. December 31st, 1952. 7:30 in the evening. A small plane sets down on a strip cut into frozen dark, and two men climb out into cold that the pilot logs without comment and the passengers will remember for the rest of their lives. One is Andrea Puharich, 34 years old, a Northwestern-trained physician who had already walked away from a conventional medical career to chase a single stranger question. Does the human nervous system receive information it has no business receiving? The other is a small, soft-spoken Indian scholar named Dundarj Ghanshyam Vinod, a philosopher from Pune whom Puharich had met for the first time 10 months earlier and had already come to trust the way other men trust their own eyes. A third man is waiting on the tarmac. Henry Jackson, Hank to everyone, runs the laboratory they're driving to tonight. A converted barn on a stretch of coast near Camden that a small circle of extraordinarily wealthy East Coast families has spent 4 years quietly turning into one of the strangest research institutions in the country. They get in the car. They drive through falling snow, making small talk about nothing, while somewhere behind them in Washington the architecture of the American national security state is entering its most paranoid and least accountable decade. A decade that, tonight, none of the three men in that car have any reason to think has anything to do with them. They would be wrong. It would take 11 years to find out how wrong. They reach the lab. Vinod doesn't say a word. He doesn't take off his coat. He walks into the library, sits down on a sofa, and goes somewhere Puharich and Jackson can't follow. The house, usually loud with staff and visitors and the general business of a working research foundation, has gone completely unnaturally silent. No child, no animal, no floorboard. Puharich would later call it the hushed silence of expectancy. The two men sit across from their entranced sage and wait. At exactly 9 o'clock, a voice comes out of Vinod's mouth that is not Vinod's voice. It is deep, resonant, and speaks English without the trace of an accent Vinod had carried in every prior conversation. It identifies itself in a single sentence Puharich would transcribe that night and publish, decades later, almost exactly as he heard it. We are 9 principles and forces. Nobody in that room had asked to hear from 9 of anything. Nobody had a framework for what was about to happen to them over the following year, and to the country over the following decade. But the number was already there, sitting in the room with them, before anyone had a chance to go looking for it. To understand why a Northwestern-trained physician was sitting in a converted barn in Maine on New Year's Eve waiting for a trance to end, you have to go back further than 1952. Henry Carell Puharich, he'd Americanized it to Andrea, was born in Chicago in 1918 to Croatian immigrant parents, trained in medicine, and by every early indication was headed for an unremarkable and comfortable clinical career. His father-in-law was a prominent surgeon who expected exactly that. Instead, sometime in the mid-1940s, a chance introduction to a violinist living in coastal Maine, a man immersed in Eastern religious thought and the emerging post-war literature on extrasensory perception, pulled Puharich sideways into a question that never let him go. He found ordinary medicine boring by comparison. He wanted to know if telepathy was real, and if it was real, whether it could be measured, triggered, and eventually used. In 1948, he founded the Round Table Foundation of Electrobiology on the Maine coast, and he built it like a scientist, not a mystic. There was a large Faraday cage on the property, constructed to shield test subjects from ambient electromagnetic interference while Puharich ran them through telepathy and clairvoyance trials. Two of the era's most closely studied psychics, the Irish medium Eileen Garrett and the Dutch clairvoyant Peter Herkos, passed through the lab's doors before Vinod ever arrived. This was not, at least in its founder's own self-conception, a séance parlor. It was a research institute that happened to be investigating something most of Puharich's medical colleagues considered career suicide to take seriously. It ran on money, and the money came from a very specific kind of donor. 2. Vinod entered Puharich's life in February of 1952, 10 months before that New Year's Eve flight to Augusta. Their first meeting was not in a lab. Vinod took hold of the middle joint of Puharich's right ring finger, whistled softly between his teeth as if searching for a pitch, and, after about a minute, began describing details of Puharich's past he had no ordinary way of knowing, along with a confident prediction about his future. Puharich was, by his own account, floored. He invited Vinod back for a second reading, this time under laboratory conditions, and began arranging for the visiting scholar to spend an extended stay at the Round Table Foundation before he was due to return to India. That New Year's Eve session, the one where the deep voice announced itself as 9 principles and forces, was not a one-time event. Over the following months, as Vinod's visit stretched on, the group at the foundation returned to the sofa in the library again and again to hear more of what Puharich came to call, simply, the 9. He would later argue, drawing on his own study of comparative religion, that the entity's self-description mapped onto the Ennead of Heliopolis, the 9-fold company of gods that stood at the center of ancient Egyptian cosmology, worshipped nearly 3,000 years before Vinod ever whistled between his teeth in a main library. What survives in Puharich's own account of those sessions is less a single dramatic prophecy than an accumulating months-long conversation about the structure of consciousness, about the shape of history, and, according to Puharich's later writing, about certain individuals the 9 expressed a specific and repeated interest in. He called such a person a vehicle. He would spend the next 4 decades of his life trying to figure out who qualified and why. None of that can be independently verified as anything other than what the people in the room believed they were experiencing. What can be verified is who those people were, and that is, in its own way, just as strange a story. 3. The exact guest list for the Round Table Foundation's inner circle shifts a little depending on which account you read and which specific evening you're asking about. Puharich's own papers, the recollections of later researchers, and the Foundation's own thin surviving records don't perfectly agree with each other, and this book won't pretend they do. But certain names appear again and again, anchoring every version of the story, and by 1952 they made the Round Table Foundation one of the best-funded fringe research operations in the United States. There was Alice Astor Bouverie, born Alice Astor, into the family whose name is a byword for old New York money. Twice divorced from European nobility by the time she started underwriting parapsychology research in Maine. There was Marcella DuPont of the DuPont chemical dynasty. There was Henry Belk, heir to a Southern department store fortune. And there was a married couple who would turn out, in the fullness of time, to matter more to this story than any of the others, Arthur M. Young, the philosopher-inventor who had designed the rotor system for the Bell 47, the first helicopter certified for civilian use in America, and his wife Ruth Forbes Young. Ruth Forbes Young was a Boston Brahmin in the fullest sense of the term, a great-granddaughter of Ralph Waldo Emerson, a member of the Forbes family on her father's side and the Cabot family on her mother's, the 2 names New Englanders invoke when they want to describe old money talking only to God. By the time she stood in that main library, Ruth had already been married once before, to a Harvard-educated architect and left-wing activist named Lyman Payne, with whom she'd had 2 sons before their 1934 divorce. She would go on, with Arthur Young, to co-found an institute for the study of consciousness on the West Coast, and later still to found an organization dedicated to international peace diplomacy. Practically every biography of her written since treats the Round Table years as a colorful, easily skipped early chapter in a long and admirable public life. This book is going to ask you not to skip it. For here is what the documented record actually supports, stated plainly, before anyone starts drawing lines between the dots. In the closing weeks of 1952, a credentialed American physician with a documented interest from military and intelligence circles convened a small, wealthy, socially prominent circle of New Englanders in a private Maine laboratory, where a visiting Indian scholar began channeling a disembodied intelligence that called itself 9 and expressed an ongoing interest in specific human beings it wished to use. Here is what happened next, and this part isn't in dispute either. 8 weeks after that New Year's Eve session, on February 26, 1953, Andrea Puharich was commissioned as an officer at the U.S. Army Chemical Center at Edgewood Arsenal, the facility that, 6 weeks after that, in April 1953, became ground zero for the CIA's newly authorized culture program. The Army's own interest in Puharich predated the 9. He had briefed Pentagon officials on the military applications of ESP research as early as November 1952, a month before Vinod's first trance. Whatever else you want to call the timing of those 3 dates, a Pentagon briefing, a channeled first contact, and a classified Army commission, arriving within the span of 15 weeks, coincidence is doing a great deal of work to hold that sentence together. Puharich's own account of his 2 years of active service at Edgewood is, by his biographer's own admission, the thinnest documented stretch of his adult life. What survives is fragmentary. A 1953 lecture he delivered to Army Chemical Center staff on the biological foundations of extrasensory perception, and a matching invitation to brief Air Force personnel on the same subject. The Round Table Foundation, meanwhile, kept running without him, funded by the same circle of donors, waiting for its founder to come home. When Aldous Huxley visited the main laboratory in the summer of 1955, 3 months after Puharich's discharge from the army, he wrote to a friend afterward that he was curious to see what Puharich would get up to now that the military had let him go. What Puharich got up to over the following 2 decades is its own long story, one that eventually put him in a laboratory with a young Israeli performer named Uri Geller, in front of a live national television audience, and in the personal orbit of at least one sitting American vice president. That story runs parallel to this one, and this book will come back to it. But it isn't the thread we're pulling on here. Ruth Forbes Young went home from Maine at the end of that winter to the rest of her considerable life. The Consciousness Institute, the Peace Foundation, the causes that would eventually fill her obituaries and leave the Round Table Foundation as a footnote. Her son by her first marriage, a Harvard dropout turned research engineer named Michael, was 24 years old that New Year's Eve, and as far as any surviving record shows, nowhere near Maine. 11 years later, in a suburb outside Dallas, Texas, Michael's wife would open her garage to a Russian émigré's houseguest, a troubled young defector back from the Soviet Union with a Russian wife and a growing collection of belongings that didn't fit in his own rented room. She would store his things there for months. She would help his wife find a place to live in her own home. She would, in the process, put her married name into the middle of the most examined 9 seconds of the 20th century. The record will show that her married name was Payne. We'll pick that up in Chapter 2.